Good evening and welcome to our webinar series, HERstory, HIStory, Our Story, Learning About and Engaging with the Past. I'm Hasini, series moderator, and this webinar series is organized by the International Center for Ethnic Studies together with Rosa Luxembourg Foundation, South Asia. So thank you for joining the final chapter, as most of you know. Since this six-part webinar series has been going on for a couple of weeks now, let me quickly give you a recap of what we have been doing so far. So when we started with the webinar series, our goal was to challenge and complicate history, especially the way it's being treated and interpreted today, and also to highlight ways in which we can bring alternative perspectives into history education. So to start off, we had Dr. Nirmal Ranjit Devasiri, who was our first speaker, a historian, drawing our attention to the unavoidable mythification that happens, especially when we try to deal with ancient history. Our second webinar was where Professor Jagat Veerasinghe gave us a unique way of understanding Sigiriya by contextualizing archaeological evidence vis-a-vis the narratives of communities that surround it. This was followed by our third webinar. Dr. Sasankas Pereira spoke as a sociologist, highlighting the need for understanding how the present politics and the present times influence our interpretation of the past. Then we shifted our focus to history education with Natasha Karunaratne, who highlighted some of the challenges we face, as well as Naila Hamade, who followed her from Lebanon by sharing her own experiences of working with history teachers in the Lebanese context, where we could actually draw a lot of parallels and learn lessons that were applicable to our own context. So today we hope to bring the series to a close by looking at art as a methodological tool for alternative history. But before I introduce the speaker, let me take you through a few routine technical reminders, especially for the people who are joining us for the first time. Those who are regular, please bear with us. So the first is the interpretation. This event is available to be followed in Sinhala and Tamil with simultaneous interpretations. And if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see in the interpretation menu, two channels as Chinese and Japanese. Unfortunately, we are unable to list Sinhala and Tamil as languages yet with Zoom, but if you tune into Chinese, you will be able to follow the proceedings in Sinhala with Mr. Harindra Dasanayaka, our usual interpreter. And if you tune into Japanese channel, you will be following the proceedings in Tamil with Humaira Arham, who is our Tamil interpreter. The next is about live streaming. If there is anybody who has not been able to register or not received a link, you can follow the proceedings and even interact by asking questions through our Facebook live streaming platform. You have to go into Facebook and log into ICES Sri Lanka Facebook page, where this is now live streaming at the moment. As usual, our program format is simple. It will be a presentation by our guest speaker for about 30 minutes at first, which will be followed by a Q&A. I will give more instructions regarding the Q&A when we get to that point. Just quickly to say that to use the Q&A box to direct questions to the guest speaker, and to use the chat box for communications with other attendees and the hosts of the event, sorry. So let me now introduce the speaker. So Thamotharampillai Sanathanan is a visual artist and an art historian who is attached to the Department of Fine Arts, University of Jaffna. I got to know Sanathanan especially through his work and him as an artist. And Sanathanan's art practice is very evocative of loss, memory, home, and the self. His work involves various disciplines such as research, documentation, oral history, and aesthetics of exploring complex issues. especially related to Sri Lanka's civil war. So that's why we felt that Sanathanan would be an ideal fit to bring in this dimension of practice to historiography, which is creative practice. So I am going to invite Sanathanan to take over and give his presentation. Welcome, Sanathanan. It's lovely to have you here. The floor is Sana, you can unmute your microphone now and also start sharing your screen. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Harini, for that wonderful introduction and for this invitation to participate in this webinar, which is actually discussing something very crucial to this country. So my presentation is actually based on my artwork as well as kind of a response to what we have already listened from other speakers. So it's talk about representation, and I'm trying to connect art and history through representation, and then find I also problematize both art and history through representation, and then get into discussing some of my work. So representation is like representation is an act of, if you look at the dictionary meaning, it's an act of speaking or acting on behalf of someone, or the state of being, state of being or representation. The description or portrayal of someone or something in particular way also mean representation. David Sumer actually gave us a kind of a interesting, give me a minute. Yeah, so David Sumer's interpretation of representation is, I think it's very useful for this discussion. He says the word representation obviously and literally contains a term present, in that it also propose the presentation of something as well as presence of someone by whom and to whom presentation is made. With that, I can get into this piece of work. It's called René Magritt's work, a surrealist painter. He did a series of work like this. It's called "This Is Not the Pipe." He has written "This Is Not the Pipe" underneath. So this actually talk about representation very nicely, because it's like this is an image of the pipe. This is a representation of the pipe. You can't just pick up this pipe and smoke. So it's not actual. This is an image of the pipe. So that's what he mentioned. This is not the pipe. So this is an image of the pipe. So he differentiate how artistic representation and the actual thing actually varies, and how varies characteristically. So in that case, representation become a kind of representation actually become a kind of a normal through a kind of a constant reuse, and come to feel natural and unmediated. A key concern is the way in which representations are made to seem natural, or despite of the fact they change over the time. So that number one, basically the representation is become, so it's like through mode of representation, or by reusing certain signs or narrations or patterns, actually it's become neutral and neutral. So representation is unavoidably selective and foregrounding something and backgrounding others. So that is, I think, very important in terms of understanding this politics. It's actually it's very selective in that case. Representation required interpretation. That is also very important when you look at history. Like a representation requires interpretation, meaning is always subject to individual interpretation. Representation always involves construction of reality from a particular point of view. So that is also, I think, it's already discussed when we discuss Mahavamsa or some of the historical sites. It's most of the presentations already discussed about this, how it's also having a kind of particular view. So system of representations are the means by which the concerns of ideologies are formed to create a way of looking at text. Such value system position the subject. So it's also talk about how representation produce a certain kind of subject through its process or mechanism. So history also, so if I look at, so in that case, art is always a representation. So it's represent the reality through the eye of an artist. Also the artist ideology, artist ideology and his own preferences actually frame that view, and then it's presented. So it's like what we see in a kind of a artwork is not actually the reality, it's a representation of the reality. Similarly, we also understand from our earlier discussions that history is not past. So history is not directly past. History is a representation of past. So that representation is happening through the mediation of evidences, mediation of methodology, mediation by ideology and subjectivity of both the historian and the reader. So that actually the earlier presenters actually lengthily discussed with the very interesting examples. In that case, I think, so in our earlier discussions, there were some points I find it's maybe very interesting to touch upon in terms of my presentation. But like in Sasanga's presentation, he asked, there is a common man in our history. And also, like earlier to him, Jagat and Dr. Nirmal actually talk about stories and myths and oral histories, and as history or history as stories and myths and myths. So it's also we also start thinking about how to differentiate these kind of things. And also many of the presentations actually concentrated on archaeological and textual evidences. So I think that is, so it also shows that in Sri Lanka, particularly the way we are teaching and constructing history is also dealing with archaeological material and textual material, which I find highly problematic, because when you come to contemporary history or modern history, what kind of archaeological material we can get in. And partly this whole problem of the nation building, or the whole project of nation building, is associated with finding out your uninterrupted linear past through archaeological material. So if you have that material, or if you appropriate that material, then you have a kind of a larger claim on the nation. And if you don't have it, then you are the outsider of the nation. So this is the way so there's a kind of materialistic bias in terms of writing the history. So in that case, what my other argument is, art as a representation of history. Art also represents history. Art also represents history in many ways. So like the way a text represents the history, art or artifact or a kind of or coin or a kind of a inscription represent the history. Art also represents the history. It also represents a history. And at the same time, art is also produced through a kind of a historical discourse. I'm using the word discourse as a way Foucault used it. So it's like art become art, or the reality of the art become reality through a certain kind of discourses. So historical discourses actually produce art. At the same time, art is not innocent in that case. Art is also produce discourses and disseminate historical discourses. So which is I think very important to look at, because in the Western tradition there is a total genre called historic paintings, which deals with all the historical or mythical subjects or heroes, stories of heroes from the classical time. And also in our own traditions, like it's talk about heroes, kings, and lovers, and all kinds of and or gods and goddesses and all these things. So it's also part of the history painting or history artwork tradition. So in that case, I think this terminologies and this whole practice actually connected with art and history making. Oh, I'm unable to move the slides. Okay, sorry for that interruption. Yeah, so this I think I'm just taking an example from Kalani Rajameha Vihara because this was discussed earlier in one of the presentations. So here, Solis Mandis painted like a kind of actually he painted mythology like Buddha's life history, like Buddha Charita, and the Buddhism's history in Sri Lanka, and also a kind of a personal history of the patron. So here Helen Vijayawatna is shown with her family, and also here the Sanghamitas visit to Sri Lanka also painted. So what I find interesting is how these things are put together, or like through a kind of a style of painting, or a kind of a new classical style of painting, how these differences are, the difference between mythology, difference between history, difference between like present and the medieval, all kinds of differences are put together and amalgamated within one frame. So here the distinction between history and mythology, distinction between popular belief and history, all these things are actually erased actually in this process. So actually, so the art become a kind of a tool for making this as a kind of a history. So this become Vijaya's Vijaya coming of Sri Lanka actually become actualized through this kind of a visual image. So, and also the textual become visual, so that actually publicly become more accessible. And so it's having a totally different kind of imagination. So if you look at the entire temple, what is the temple talking about? So for me, I think it's talking about modern Sri Lanka as a kind of a island of Sinhalese or island of Buddhism, and put these two traces like two different categories into one. Yeah, so in that, so that's a way. So if you look at many of the artwork, this kind of amalgamation or this kind of project is very much visible. But when you come to history of, so similarly, when you come to history of civil war, it's also that history is also written in different forms. Like there are memorials available now. It's also maybe military memorials in many cases, and fictions, and a lot of fictions coming. So it's like mainly English fiction. Like it's written by Sri Lankans. It's written by people who lived outside the war zones, people who lived outside of Sri Lanka through their researches and all these things. There's a fiction coming in, and also then films and political speeches, biographies, and accounts of military persons and militants also available. Also talk about the civil war or our recent past in different forms. Similarly, theater and visual arts also play a major role in capitalizing this kind of a historical this thing. So in that case, I think similarly, when you look at this work of art, or also we can read as also they are also producing a certain kind of histories. So we have to ask this from the zoomer's point of view: by whom, for whom, and for what reason these narrations or these representations are being made. So I just wanted to bring that one example to find out this problem further. So this most of these representation are from a kind of So who can make this representation? Who is having the agency to make this representation? That is a kind of a question. And so I think who is having the power? Because if you look at the textbooks, if you look at the if you look at the official channels and all these things, certain kinds of histories are actually disseminated, and certain kinds of histories are made mute. So in that case, I take one example, how memory and history actually played out in contemporary politics, or understand how contemporary politics or ideological frameworks actually monitor and structure the contemporary memory. So this is a photograph from the photograph of the Jaffna Public Library, which was burned in 1981, and then it's renovated during the Chandrika Kumaratunga government, and it's made it like this. But if you go to this library, there is no information about this burning or rebuilding. So it's totally that part of the story is totally muted or frozen, and this building is not having any kind of traces of that part of the history. But if you look at this one, this is Dalada Maligawa after the LTT bomb blast. Then it was renovated as it is, like the way the library was renovated. And it's also created its own museum within the temple complex, which portray the atrocities made by the LTT. So when you look at now, similarly, if you look at the northern east part, the northern east become a kind of a epicenter of the civil war. But if you look at the northern east part, most of these kind of evidence are totally erased, and most of all the evidence are in other places. Like if you look at bomb blast in Kandy and bomb blast in Colombo and similar kind of bomb blast and aerial bombing in Jaffna, Jaffna is not having any traces. So in the future, actually the civil war evidence are in Kandy, not in Jaffna. So this actually the whole erasure of the history is happening through the erasure of the evidences. And that actually made actually shows that how the power and power is connected to a certain in the making of certain kind of history visible and certain kind of history invisible. So in that case, I also argue in this case, like partly many of the conflicts, including the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, are produce of historical narrations. It may be it's maybe a caste conflict, or it may be a gender conflict. It may be a regional conflict, or a conflict of like connected to conflicts conflicts that connected to environmental issues. It's all actually kind of it's also built up with a kind of historical discourse. So historical narration also it's also a product of a conflict, like the way we see how Mahavamsa represent the history. And how Mahavamsa represent certain kinds of conflict, and at the same time how Mahavamsa also produce a kind of certain kinds of conflict. So in that case, as an artist, my whole engagement with history is how to draw the histories of subaltern, like the people who are not having the agencies. So in terms of caste, class, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, regions, and all these things. So how to do a method, because our historical methods are based on, our history writing is mostly concentrating on textual evidences, archaeological evidences, and all these things. And also it's like textual evidences mean these Mahavamsa, Sulavamsa kind of textual evidences. So what to do with the contemporary history, and what are the other ways of writing the history, and how to bring others' history into the kind of discussion. That is my whole question here. And I'm also trying to ask this question, where is a common man history in this conflict? Actually, this if you look at the memorials, if you look at most of the writings, you can see either it's in the government side or it's in the LTT or the militant side. It's the people who carry the burden of the civil war is not represented in any of the historical narration, or fully represented in any kind of a historical narration. Even if you look at the memorials for a common man or civilians, it's not very few are existing in that case, and where they are existing and for whom they are existing, who made that, for what purpose, is also very important to answer to understand this problem. So, so my whole other question is how to make history accessible to many people, how to represent multiple voices in history. It may be a kind of a challenge with each one, or competing with each one, or but how to bring that conflict of history, conflict of memory in that in this kind of a discussion. Yeah, so in that case, I just wanted to discuss some of my painting, some of my works which deal with this this issue. But it's actually, these works are actually developed through maybe the first work came into existence in 2004, but before that, even my art practice dealing with similar kind of issues. So in that case, I don't want to confine this into history or memory project. It's my general practice actually dealing with my own surrounding. So this is the way I respond to my surroundings. So these works are actually responding to many other complex issues than history and memory. So I don't want to reduce the scope of reading into these two topics, but since this presentation is related to that, so I'm just concentrating on that aspect. I did a collective installation in 2004 in Public Library Jaffna. This called History of Histories, where we collected 500 objects from homes in Jaffna, which represent or remind that time that happened in 2004 during the Norwegian mediated peace talk. So we asked the people to give us something that remind or represent their 25 years of existence in this war zone. So then when we exhibited in this form, it's called History of Histories in the Public Library, and Public Library was newly renovated and opened. So we utilized those bookshelves which were not occupied by the books in that time. My slide is not moving, just give me a minute.
Sanathanan, shall I try to share it from my side?
Yeah, that is also possible. Can I stop slide sharing?
Yes. Bear with us for a few minutes till we get the presentation back up. Sanathanan, can you try to share it again? Because it seems that mine is also not going up. So, from your side?
So this actually, let me also talk while sharing this. So this project actually happened during this peace talk time, and so these objects are randomly collected in a rhizoming process. So 500 objects, it varies from like sand, water, letters of the personals, photographs, and so on. So can you see? Can you see, Harshini?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. Yeah, so this, then following that, I got an invitation to work in Vancouver with a Tamil diaspora. So I work with I used a similar kind of method. I asked them to give something which related to their imagining or imaging home in Vancouver. The answer was this. So it's also very interesting that Vancouver Anthropology Museum is having many collections, and including a little collection from Sri Lanka, mainly from this ritual mask from the southern coast of Sri Lanka. So the locals there find that they don't have any, their history is not represented in that museum. So this actually gave them to bring their history into this for a short period of time. I don't want to get into discuss this in detail, but if there's any questions, I can attend that later on. But it's a kind of a similar way of object collection of these people. But in the initial stage, in the first project, people also, when they gave objects, they also gave stories to us. They started talking. They started breaking up. They become very emotional when they were giving this object to us, which I was not very concerned when I was started this project. And the second project actually gave a kind of a consignment form where we asked the people to write their stories if they want. So objects came with the stories to the museums. So this was the way we exhibited some of these things. So there's a barbed wire in it. There's a Tamil Arasukachi's flag in it, and there's their registration card, similar thing. So that actually gave me a kind of an insight to look at this project in a wider perspective. And I did a book project in 2012. It's commissioned and published by Raking Leaves London. It's actually talk about displacement through ground plan of the houses. So where I asked people to draw their ground plan of the houses. So when I asked people to draw the ground plan of the houses, they also started narrating about what has happened to that house and how the social and historical it's fabricated through this construction of the house, and or the dismantle of the house or displacement, how actually affected that. So these stories are collected through a kind of a drawing of their ground plan, and then I also responded that as a kind of my own drawing. So the book is having 80 stories, and 80 stories are having presented in a form of four leaves. One is actually my drawing to their response as a response to their story, and one side there's an extract from their story, and they have drawn their ground plan. The ground plan of the ground plan and the architectural rendering of the ground plan also included in that presentation. Okay. So this also it's like it's also this project actually happening in 2012 when 2011 and 12 when most of the LTT cemeteries were vacuum cleaned and their memorials were demolished and military memorials are coming in. So this project is actually a kind of a parallel project with this. And also this whole commemoration and remembering war in this form is actually totally banned in Sri Lanka during that time. And this project that came up, it's not intentional, but while I was working, this was a kind of a situation. Oh, again the same problem.
Are you stuck again? I can try to share it from my side. If you, maybe what you can do is actually stop sharing and reshare again. Apologies to the participants with this slight challenge that we have.
Are you sharing?
Do you want to share again or should I share?
I don't think. Why don't you try? It's working now. Okay. Yeah. So then as a continuation of that project, I did in 2016. I did another work called Cabinet of Resistance, in which I collected stories of common people who were struggling or finding out innovative solution for the situation created by the civil war, and it was displayed in a format of a library index box. So these index cards are having stories and sometimes also some drawings in it. And it's having 25 stories of different people talking about how they survive during the war and how they resist or how they resist during the war.
Shall I go on with the slides? Sorry, please bear with Sana for a few minutes. Yes, Sanathanan has got disconnected, so please bear with us till we get him back online. Please bear with us. Our speaker will be back with us shortly. Meanwhile, you can all use the Q&A box to write in your questions. Yeah, thank you. They're rolling in. Thank you very much. So I'm inviting you already to send some questions, to use the time to send some questions while we try to get back Sanathanan, who's joining us from Jaffna. Okay, we have him back, but let's give him a few seconds to figure out. Welcome back, Sanathanan. So, yeah, I will try to share the screen again.
Okay.
And please let me know when you want me to move on to the next slide.
Sure, yes. Okay.
You were talking about this
Yes.
one?
This one, yeah, this one. So these cabinets are actually having documents. So this drawer is actually having documents, and there were 80 documents. And if you open the drawers, you will find, next slide, please. If you open the drawer, next one. If you open the drawers, you will find a story of the story of the document, and also a drawing as a response to that, and also a small description of the document. So I'm going to read one or two examples from this stories to get a kind of a real texture of this documents. So one document called Vavuniya Pass. Vavuniya is a town in Sri Lanka situated between the Sinhala-dominated south and the Tamil-dominated north. When the north was under the control of Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam in 1990s, Vavuniya police introduced a pass system for non-residents staying in the town. This included a day pass and the permanent pass. Kumari's family forced to move out of Jaffna in November 1995 due to the creation of a high security zone, and found a shelter in the refugee camp in Vavuniya. They were settled in housing scheme in October 1998. During that time, Vavuniya was the border zone between the northern battleground and the rest of the country. People coming from the war zone People coming from the war zone who were above the age of 8 were compelled to register themselves with the police under the emergency regulation. The police would initially give them one-day pass, with the people needing to renew their passes every day. Later, the police introduced a week pass and a 2-week pass. Most of their days were spent in front of the police station waiting for the renewal of the pass. Each time they applied for renewal, they had to produce photocopies of various documents. Kumar still remember that the smell of the ink and the moving light of the photocopier and the hanging sequence decoration in the three-wheeler they hired to travel to the police station. Then there's another document called family card. A family card is a document issued by an area military office in Jaffna. With a, but these images are not connected to that. I randomly put some images, so you can't find the real images. So a family card is a document document issued by the area military office in Jaffna with a certification of village administrator and the military commander to civilians living under their control from 1995 to 2009. The document includes the particulars of each household and the group and a group photograph. Every household in Jaffna was instructed to hang their family cards in front of their houses. Suresh had to hang this family card along with a group photograph of his family in front of his own house. 3 generations of his family went into the nearby school to get their family photographs clicked by an army man. It was the first time in his life his photograph was taken by an army man. Then there is a story from a displaced Muslim. It's on marriage certificate. A marriage certificate, a copy of the record. Marriage certificate is a copy of a record of a legal marriage, which deals with names and dates and etc. When they were ordered to vacate their houses in Jaffna in 1990, Najla was not allowed to take any of their belongings with her. She was only allowed to carry her 4-month-old baby. Without her documents, she underwent numerous hardships in her everyday life. Getting a birth certificate for her child was crucial for school admission. Since Najla lost her marriage certificate, she couldn't apply for her daughter's birth certificate. To solve that problem, she got a fresh registration of her existing marriage in Itambua. According to new certificate, her elder daughter was born before her marriage. Then there is another document called a land deed.
Sanathanan, I'm just going to gently remind you of our time limitation also.
Okay.
So
one more story and finish it. The present system of land registration in Sri Lanka, which based on the registration of deeds, was introduced in Sri Lanka in 1864. In this system, it is the deed which is registered. A deed is a record of a particular transaction and serve as a evidence of a specific agreement. Karan was born when his parents were displaced. His elder brother told him that he changed schools 9 times in 9 years due to the multiple displacement. They lived in many houses, but the one they owned remained under the Sri Lankan military occupation. Karan does not have a childhood friends because he never stayed in one place for long enough to make a friendship. He never had a sense of belonging to a particular place. Just before the military released the Karan's ancestral land, which they had used for 30 years, his mother brought a new piece of land in another location. Since he had a sentimental attachment to the ancestral land, she sold the new property. Now they are resettled in their legally owned land. But for Karan, it is yet another displacement. Can you go to the last slide, please, Harini? So yeah, just so this actually one more one slide before this. Yeah, so this is another series of my work which dealing with jigsaws, and these are unfit. These jigsaws cannot be sit together in terms of their shape and in terms of their visuals. So I see history as a kind of this kind of a disjuncture, kind of a dislocation. Next slide, please. So here I use, so if I just summarize these works and how I actually trace, what are the evidences I use for making these projects, stories, drawings, ethnography, object, memory, oral histories, archiving, and also a collective, most of these works are very collective projects. It's not my stories, these are stories from 80 or 500 people. Next slide, please. So my whole question is this: so how to draw multiple histories? Like Gayatri's work actually opened a discussion about can subaltern speak. So in that, most of the feminists and most of the subaltern groups actually argue whether we use speak for or speak with. So I think most of the problem actually arises when the historian actually start or the artist start when they speak for someone. So these projects I shared with you actually speak with these people, and so it's also giving a kind of a agency for these people. So here the artist or the historian become a kind of a facilitator than a producer. With that, I conclude this. Over to you, Harsini.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sanathanan. That was really a rich presentation. And also thank you very much for sort of wrapping up and drawing from the previous presentations. I thought you did a fantastic job there by actually following every webinar and also picking up the strands from that and weaving it into your webinar. So I'm very thankful for that, first and foremost. Secondly, I'm also very thankful for sharing some of these stories that need to be heard, that don't always have as much attention and platforms to be shared in. So thank you for sharing them. And I'm very sorry if I were to cut you short, simply because I do see that there are quite a few questions that are coming up that we can go into. So now the Q&A session is open. Please use the question and answer box to pose your question to Sanathanan. And also you can vote them up. So if you do see a question that's already there, please vote for that so that it can go up to the top to the list where we can take it up. So one of the first questions that have come in, Sana, and I think it's an interesting question to start the whole discussion with. Maybe even an obvious question, but an important question because it's touching the fundamentals. There is M.M. Rizwan raising this question called, what is the connection between art and society? So he's asking a very fundamental question, but I think still you can try to give a brief answer before we go forward.
Yeah, so I see art as any other kind of activity involved with our day-to-day life. So it's like the whole production and consumption or circulation of art is actually socially embedded. So without society, there's no art. So there is a kind of there is some sort of a romantic view that art and artists are away from the society and in a kind of imaginative world. Even if you consider that the imagination is also rooted in kind of your day-to-day existence and experience. So I think its art is actually very much connected to society, and it's also produced a kind of it's also came from the society, or it's also a product of social experience. At the same time, it's also produced society through certain kinds of projecting certain kinds of ethics and ideologies and political agendas and all these things. It's also produced culture and society. So in that case, it's a kind of it is more crucial to the society, and also it's more than that. It's like it's also having kind of psychological dimensions and other kinds of dimension, aesthetic dimension, and all these things, which is also very important to the of the well-being or the healthy society.
Yes, thank you. I think that was a good starting point for our discussion. So there is another question raised by Jiva Perumal Pillai from Essex. What was the impact on the local population who were affected by the war to your installation of 2004? Did it help in their grieving process? Did the new Jaffna Cultural Center display similar exhibits permanently?
Okay, the first question, I think, yeah, that's a very interesting question. So then we were exhibited that work in the public library. So it's also coincide with another exhibition, or this also produced for another exhibition called Ahampuram, Outer and Inner. That actually brought artworks from the south, or artworks dealing with militarization and civil war and other kinds of issues in the south, and it's brought into Jaffna, and we put together all the works in one site. So this is also a kind of this exhibition is also our history of history project also actually kind of we produced for that particular exhibition. It was part of the exhibition. So in that case, so in that concept note, I and Jagat Veer Singh actually curated that exhibition. In that curational note, we mentioned that. Buddhist a story from Jataka, where a mother lost her son and by a snake bite or something, and she went to Buddha to give a life to him, and Buddha asked him to go and find some rice or some other material from a house where death never echoed. And so in that case, this mother went and found that there's no house without the occurrence of a death. So similarly, there was no house affected by, there was no house in Jaffna which was not untouched by the war. So that was a kind of a main theme of this exhibit. So what happened was many people, so they gave different kind of material. So when the people came and they were actually looking for their material. So we didn't have a kind of labeling or labeling. It's all exhibited in a kind of identical container. So you have to search for your own material. So while searching, while going through 500 material, while looking for their own material, they realized that this is happening to everyone. So this became a kind of a collective kind of a loss, or it's talk about collective pain. Actually, most of the psychologists arguing that gave a kind of an agency for these people who are affected by the trauma to come out. So this also become then in that case it's become a very sharing site. So which I never thought about, but that was happened when they came to look for it. And they were also a bit, in one way, they also happy with that it's all got some sort of representation in that Bern library. And also during that time, a lot of tourists came, and a lot of people came from like from diaspora, from overseas, from southern Sri Lanka, came to see the library because that was newly opened. So they also looked at, many of the people also confused this object with the Bern library story. So it's also very interesting how they see that as a kind of connection to this project. The second question, I don't know because when we did this exhibition, after that there was some initiative to exhibit that objects permanently in the library. So that was because of various reasons that librarian was afraid, and we were not able to succeed enough to install that permanently, because it's also under so many other pressures, because that time it was under defense ministry or foreign ministry or something. So it's not that easy. So I think similar problem we may be having in terms of Indian Cultural Center. So I'm not able to answer that. Yeah.
Yeah, since we are discussing a little bit about the process, I would like to take up a question that goes in that direction. This is raised by Robert Degersman. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Thank you for that very elucidating presentation. How do you move these gathered narratives within the communities from where they were drawn, instead of taking them elsewhere for others to see? What are the ethics behind sourced narratives and using them? I think it's a very interesting and sharp question. So, Sanathanan.
Yeah, so I think, that's a very important question, I think. So the first project, actually an interesting, now I can tell you what has happened to the first project. So ethically, what kind of decisions we made. After that history of history project, actually it was It was then in 2007, 2006, the war re-accelerated, and these objects which I collected are become highly risk or prohibited under the emergency laws. So keeping that with you is a kind of a problem. So a lot of people ask me what to do with this, and like I was thinking about what to do with that. But when people gave that object to us, they simply gave that. They didn't see that as a like a big event, because some are like water, some are like sand and ash and particles of the Totem buildings and barbed wires and all these things. So those are not having any big material value, and like in the sense like economical value in that case. But for me, it's their stories, it's their memories, which I never thought like when I started playing with this. But later on, I become I'm confined to that, and that burden was with me. So I thought, no, I can't throw them. So in the end, what we did was we buried it. So the entire project is buried. So that's the way I sort out that problem. So similarly, in this case, these stories I'm not an outsider. These stories are my stories. These stories are like my questions to them. These projects actually came from my experience. I am living with them. So I'm not an outsider in this case. And these questions I ask to find out these things, or the methods I use are also from my own experience. So I know if you ask this kind of a question, you will get this kind of an answer. Like when I ask them to draw the houses, some people cannot be able to talk. In that case, I ask what you come into your mind as an object, or tell me about a relationship or smell or something like that. That actually came from my own experience actually. So I'm an insider in that case. So that's my outsider. I'll try to reduce the outsider's view in that. And this project is also not about this kind of stories. Are too many stories are there. There is no house without stories. So so when I went and interviewed, or when I went and talked to these people, they were I was even thinking that I may be actually meddling with their difficult past. But they were very happy in one level, because someone came to listen their stories, for stories, because there are people going for collecting stories for different purposes, for compensation, for their own development, project writing, and all kinds of things. But my project is not about that. It's just a story. So because this woman talk about a murunga tree or a cat which was lost during the war and all these things, which you don't give any this kind of information, you won't fill it in any of compensation form, or you don't give this to the government or something like that. So these ordinary things actually. So what I found, so in that case, so this actually gave them some sort of relief. So be normal, just talk about the secrets. So this actually happened. So in that case, this produced a different, so this method actually is actually produce a different kind of stories or material to understand this problem. So these materials are not for them, it's for others. So my focal point is to bring this to others to see the multiple narration operating, or multiple perspective to look at this problem. So it's not to reproduce the same story within the same society, and it doesn't have any meaning. They have better stories than this.
Yeah, thank you, Sana, for that really precise answer. So I am going to, there's a question from Irishu Tennakon about the process of incomplete Tombu, but I'm going to come back to it because there are a few other questions that I think are very important to go into, and I want to also manage time. So there is one from Gillian Julef from Essex. How do you see your work on artifacts and stories moving from art and exhibition into history? Can it be absorbed into formal histories and archives? So I think that's a very important question about translating this into being recognized as history, within quotes.
Yeah, so there are examples like when I did this project, this book project in 2011, I showed that to my Bengali friend who was a kind of a displaced, whose family was displaced during the Bengal partition. And his father actually looked at that. He was a refugee, so he actually looked at this project, and he was telling me that we didn't have an artist to do this similar project during that time when the Indian partition was happening. So now if you look at in some of the projects, say Indian artists or Indian Indian historians actually dealing with these things, this kind of an archive, and they also produce a kind of a memory museum with this kind of an objects and things like that. And there are also like examples in Bangladesh and other places where the war museums and nation or other kinds of conflict related museums were built with this kind of a material. So there is a kind of a possibility in that. So yeah, and also these findings could be re-articulated into a kind of a formal history, and this can be incorporated into our textbooks and all these things. And also what I wanted to add is also like, so I'm also very cautious about, I don't want to reproduce the conflict again. So in that case, if you look at my narrations, even in Tombu, in the book, actually, it's a kind of first-person narration. So they're talking about what has happened to them. They're not pointing the finger against another one. So which I was very cautioned about, and that's the nature of the story, actually. They were not very much, so it's my questions and my approach actually actually produced that kind of responses. So it's not, I'm not editing or something, but it's like that kind of responses. So in that case, yeah, there is a kind of possibility, and there are kind of a precedents in this kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Sana, for also taking up Irushi's question even briefly. There are two questions that go into the direction of history education, so and I think it's important. Mario Gomez is asking, he's complimenting fascinating presentation. How much of what you spoke about goes into the teaching of art history? So that's one question. There was another question about do you include contemporary art history or war art in Sri Lankan university syllabus? That is raised by Arunda Ratnaraj. So maybe you can handle these two questions together, which is about inclusion of these kinds of art in education and university education.
Yeah, so this discussion, because what we teach, in the end, why we are teaching art history or archaeology is to make the presence livable. So in that case, whatever the ancient art history or medieval art history is useless unless otherwise you invest those experiences and findings in our relate that to your contemporary life. So contemporary history is so important in that case. Our modern history is so important in that case, and Sri Lanka in that way, the other side of the conflict is it has its own characteristics. It's produced an artwork which is having its own characteristics from entire region. So we are having a kind of a module, a course unit in final year, which talk about modern and contemporary art in Sri Lanka. So that is like very much incorporated. It's not about only this kind of project. It's also talking about what has happened in the South, how the artists who were actually affected by the JVP insurgency and the government insurgency, counter insurgencies, and also what kind of and how that actually changed the whole perception of art in the South. So, so that part of the history is very much in our curriculum. Yes. So we are teaching that in one paper. And also we understand art history as not as a kind of a very aesthetic object, as the first person asked first question. So we see as a kind of a socially embedded practice. So, and also we also think that art can play a kind of a major role in bringing these kind of distances and produce something for a better world. In that case, our entire art history syllabus is approaching art from that point of view. It's not romanticized art. We are not only the entire history, except contemporary history. We are not we are actually, the basic thing is we are questioning the whole art history, existing art history, and also we are trying to understand society, conflict, and everything through art object. So the art object become a kind of a medium to or key to understand this kind of a problem. So in that case, I think Yeah, so in that case, entire syllabus is actually approaching art history from this kind of a critical point of view. So it's not about our own conflict, but also it's talk about other. When you talk about other art histories, we also see it from this kind of a perspective. So that's how it's connected to our contemporary practices, theoretical.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Facebook. You mentioned Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? Can you give any works of women artists in Sri Lanka where post-war and memory have been addressed? So.
Yeah, there are many artists actually approaching this issue. And also it's not a kind of they haven't taken it as a kind of a cerebral kind of thing, but they are actually tackling this with as part of their experience actually. So for example, there is one artist based in Hutton, Anusha. Actually, she is actually dealing with plantation issues in this, and how her mother was affected and all these things. So this kind of artistry teaching actually make her to look at her own history, and she may be the first artist from that region, and also the first women artists in that case. And similarly, there are many women artists before this kind of before 2009, like in the 80s, there was a kind of a revivalism in art scene in Jaffna in 1980s, in which painting became very important, and there most of them were women artists. They were talking about many things, the women issues, social issues. So they actually brought their intervention actually made art as a kind of a social activity. Before that, it was only related to religion, temple painting, or beautiful house paintings and flowers and landscape and that and this. So now, so they were the one who actually put this upside down. They were talking about ugliness as beauty. They talk about the darker side to this life as beauty. So that intervention actually made by 2, 3, 4 women artists actually. And there's another one living in Bangalore, actually a Sri Lankan Tamil artist. She was talking about her own existence, her own identity, self-identity, and disconnected from the entire society. And so very powerful, like it's not only political, it's also very, very, very powerful in terms of their language. It can be compared with any standard work exhibited in any museums.
Thank you. And like you said, Hanusha Somasundaram from the plantations, and also Nilani Joseph from Jaffna, they were really a younger generation of artists who are women, who are speaking up and doing wonderful work. And I think...
And also like Vasuki Jayashankar from Batiklo, she actually brought art and activism together, and like a kind of very feminist activism in that case. That she's using art as a main tool for that kind of activism.
Yeah, I think it's really important to highlight these artists who are bringing up issues and dealing with really difficult topics, you know. So there's another interesting question Madhubhashini Ratnayate is raising. I like the question, so I'm going to read it out to you. In your opinion, what is the difference between painting, image, and words? For example, fiction in conserving memory. So she's actually asking you to sort of compare across genres, almost aesthetic genres of representation.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because when I started working with this kind of a mode, collecting stories and writing stories and remaking that or responding that in the kind of visual terms, I find there is an act of translation happening. So what I found now is like what is actually happening so through this process, what I understood, art also in a kind of an act of translation. You translate emotion into word, emotion into visual, visual into word, visual into so it's many levels and objects and material, all kinds of translation. Also like you translate the time into matter and matter into time and all kinds of things also happening. So this actually make me to understand translation not to a kind of a literally language to language. It's also to medium, period to period. That kind of levels of translation is also happening. But the other aspect of it is like why I'm using this like a kind of a literal form, like a writing form, is like so many of the people are having a kind of tendency to read than visually read. So our societies are not visually well educated, or literally visual literacy is very low. So my whole thing is also, so I also paint. I also simultaneously I paint. I have a very conventional practice of painting, painting my own narrations, painting my own stories and personal histories and things like that. And also whatever learning I am having through this kind of a project, also I transfer that into my painting. So this is also kind of simultaneous project. So certain things, when you need this kind of a subtleness, abstractness, that is possible in visual language, and that education is a separate thing to understand the semiology of that. But at the same time, the literal languages may be also a kind of giving you a possibility, because of most of the people are having that what do you call, habit to read, or trained in that kind of thing. Yeah, so I see as a kind of so this by using these two models, actually two modes, actually giving me a kind of a larger viewership. That's what I am using it, and it's also a kind of a act of translation. It's a kind of never-ending translation.
There's a wonderful follow-up question.
Also, when we translate, also it's also a kind of, you translate from memory to you also translate the memory. You also translate one text to other. So there is also erasure happening. So that is the other part of the thing. Yeah. So that also we have to understand.
Yeah, there's another interesting follow-up question. Unfortunately, it's anonymous, but we will take it up. Up to what extent can this form of interpretation of art compete with the popular culture of written literature? So it's about competition now, and how much does art give an alternative perspective to written literature in the mainstream?
Yeah, so I don't know whether we can compete, or I don't know whether I can use the word compete. These are two different kind of realities in a kind of a healthy society. So I see my artist or academic as a kind of a witness at the same time. So it's also art is also a kind of a form of dissent. So I think that is my role, or that kind of stand, or that kind of standpoint should be expressed. So yeah, that is the thing. So it's not a kind of we are not. I don't think that we can substitute this with that. And so this, but that struggle between this and that actually may be an interesting in terms of production of a kind of a positive energy.
Yes, perhaps we can use the word challenge maybe rather than also competing. So yeah, basically the dialogue that happens between them is what's really important, I think. So we have two more questions, and I think we will wrap up with that. And first one is about talking about art and recreating history. How do you see the recent trend, which of course has died off now with Corona, but the recent trend of street art that we witnessed? Reproduction of history with nationalist ideologies under the notion of beautification. So I think he's asking, he or she who is raising the question is asking for your response to that.
Yeah, in fact, I was when I was thinking about how art is actually bringing also a kind of creating a kind of a discourse, and how art is also entangled with a historical discourse. Actually, I was thinking about this example. So thank you so much for bringing that into this. And so it's not a temple or a painting. Now it's in the street art. What we find is like a similar kind of tendency in that. It's as you said, it's a very nationalist. And it's also very and also it's also kind of a naive in certain levels. Yeah, so it's not a political art, but it's become very political in that context. So what was the question, Harsini?
Basically about what you see about this the trend of this street art. I think you actually answered it, Susanna. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is interesting, again, anonymous. I feel you play different roles as artist, historian, art historian, witness, and archivist. Do you produce your art with this awareness? Very, very nice question.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question, because when I did that 2004, that History of History project, I was just responding to my my surrounding without knowing what kind of politics I engage with. But when I was after seeing that work, when the Anthropology Museum invited me to do a similar project or bring that project to Vancouver, then I realized I am doing a different. I'm meddling with some other zone. Because this Anthropology Museum was interested because I'm using anthropological tools to build art, which I never thought about. I never thought when I brought this into the public library, I never thought I am meddling with anthropology in some case. So similarly, so my awareness also grew up with this kind of practices. So this archiving and all these things also, like I, as an art historian, I involve with archiving. So it's like in 2000s, after 2000, I and another friend of mine, actually, we started documenting the domestic architectural plans of Jaffna or the heritage of Jaffna. So we were visiting, a lot of other things happening, because in 2004, when they reopened Jaffna, they reopened A9, there are a lot of antique sellers coming to antique market extended to Jaffna. So most of the things are going out of that. So that's a real problem for art history. And also most of the houses are removed and all these things. So we started documenting it. And then when I conceived this Tombu project, I found, without knowing, that my own interest in architectural design started coming in. So these kind of my interest in documenting local art history actually reflecting in my work, that I later on I found, and then I found a way. That's the way I live. So there's no distinction between that and this. I can't separate my artwork from my teaching. I can't separate my art history from my practice. So now slowly I found it's not a kind of a cerebral activity. Slowly it's all coming in one line, and I also don't know where it is going. So whether I will be able to continue this, that is also. So it's not a kind of a preconceived idea, and it's also not funded by any NGO, any other kind of project. So in which I have to, reproduce this kind of thing. This is a kind of pressure I'm getting from the society which I'm living in. So there is a need for this kind of thing to represent in a collective way.
Thank you for touching upon that issue as well, Sana. And I'll take this final question, and I think it also goes in the same direction, and a good question to wrap up our discussion, raised by Hari Rajalechmi. Thank you for your presentation. What is your take on contemporary art as an apparatus that affords these practices and critical purchase and circulation? So I think it's asking about the circulation of this art, reception, purchase, etc.
Yeah. So it's like even in Colombo, it's like from 1990s onwards, there was a kind of a paradigm shift in terms of understanding art and usage of art and idea of art and all these things. And that, I argue, it's already started happening in Jaffna in 1980s, and maybe not in a kind of a big professional way, but it's also happening. So in that case, so that change actually happening within art world, and or within little avenues of art institutions and individuals. But the circulation, whether the circulation is happening, that's a real question. But there were some interesting art project or art related project I can mention, or some of these objects were used by some other project to make it visible. For example, GISAT Mobile History Museum project actually took some of these artworks, and that exhibition actually traveled all over Sri Lanka. And I and Thamotharampillai, the artist, actually we did a workshop with 12 artists from all over the country, and we visited their houses and listened their stories, look at their environment, So that actually, and that is not a very easy task for us. Because all of us are having some sort of a construct in terms of our others. So meeting them, visiting them, living them every week, meeting and discussing crucial issues are not that easy. So in the name of art, we opened up a kind of a space for sharing, and that kind of discussions happen. And in Jaffna, we are having an institution called Sri Lankan Archive for Sri Lankan Contemporary Art, Architecture and Design, where we used to have 2 talks per week, where all these artists from all over Sri Lanka come and share their experience and share their work with the locals. So this discussion is also actually happening that also actually making this circulation much wider. So these are some of the examples how these things are circulated, and but I don't think that is enough. But there is an attempt all the time.
I was hoping to close the session, but we have one last question, and let's take it. Again, it's anonymous, but it's a good question. What did you mean when you mentioned visual literacy? I know it's a basic question, but I don't think, I mean, it just shows how unaware people are about visual literacy. So maybe that's something you want to address before we wrap up.
I think I just broadened this question because like in Sasanga's presentation, Sasanga talked about like some people argue that Mahavamsa is we don't need to consider Mahavamsa. But he said, no, Mahavamsa may be an interesting text to read. Like a kind of meanings underneath those words. So that actually, so the critical reading of Mahavamsa is very important. So as a text, what is it actually saying indirectly? Similarly, visual is also a language. So visual is also having its own coding and sign system. So like the way we learn French or English or Sinhala or Tamil or whatever it is, so we have to learn that. So we believe that we actually learn to believe certain visuals, not to read certain visuals. So it's mostly ours a habit. So we see and it's like when I talk about representation, I said how representation is received. It's like a certain representation I normalize. It's appearing in front of us again and again and again, then we don't question it, like a kind of in terms of women's beauty or women's body. So we see, oh, this is the ideal beauty of the women. So who told us? Why we are looking at that? How do you know that? So that's the main problem. And also when we get into even when you, in terms of literacy, when you can read a poster, but when you read a poetry, will you be able to do that the same? Will you be able to have an ability to read a poetry or distinguish a poetry with a political slogan? So these are the kinds of nuances of reading it. So in that case, I argue, and many people also argue in that, I believe, that visual is also language. So we have to learn. Our education system is not concentrating on this visual education. So it's like we use the visual as a substitute or visual as an extended thing. But now, now there are disciplines like social, like anthropology is having a visual anthropology, sociology is having a visual sociology. So visual become a main apparatus to understand your surrounding. So artistry is a discipline which is having which is actually preserve that kind of that kind of knowledge, inspecting the visual, understanding through the visual, dissecting the visuals, and all these things are part of these things. So for that, you need a kind of a clear understanding of what is visual is about and how that language is built throughout the time and how it's utilized now. So there are theories and there are things. So I think in that case, so that's how I mentioned visual literacy. So it's not just looking at a film, looking at a poster as the way others are looking at. You look at critically. You look at the meaning underneath of the visual image. For that, you need a kind of a literacy, like the way we learn languages. Are the same way we should learn visuals.
Yeah, thank you, Sana. Thank you so much for speaking with such clarity. And in fact, I think when we were conceptualizing this whole webinar series, this was something that we discussed internally as one of our goals in terms of promoting this webinars, because like what you are saying, these are all disciplines that are having parallel tracks: history, archaeology, sociology, anthropology, art history. But hardly, because of the way our academic institutions are formed, we hardly ever speak across. And what you are talking, and especially even art and practice of art, it's about really bringing these different strands together, as much as bringing theory, praxis, and pedagogy together as well. So that was one of the fundamental positions from which we worked when we were trying to conceptualize this whole webinar series. So I'm very, very happy managed to wrap it up. And I know that we can go on, and there have been quite a few suggestions for which we are very happy about to continue the series. We will definitely consider this and talk to others, reach others, because we feel that there is a need. We hope that we can find ways next year to continue this discussion. In fact, I was talking to Sana as well. Can we do a classroom? Can we, offer a course for people who want to go in depth into these discussions? So let's hope that we will find ways to continue this kind of discussion in the future, next year. And finally, I do have to thank all our guest speakers: Dr. Nirmal Ranjit Devasiri, Professor Jagat Veerasinghe, Dr. Sasanka Pereira, Naila Hamade from Lebanon, Natasha Karuna Ratna, and Thamotharampillai Sanathanan. Thank you so much for a brilliant presentation today. So my team at International Center for Ethnic Studies, Mario, Vianga, Lihini, Nadine, our two interpreters, Harindra and Humaira, for an excellent job in executing this 6-part webinar series. It was a real experience for all of us, a learning process as well. So thank you very much from my side. I do appreciate your participation and continued interest in it. And I wish you all a wonderful Christmas season and hope to see you maybe next year with a similar series. So thank you very much and stay safe.